Some journeys begin long before you step onto a plane. For Carter, this flight wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about facing a battle he had seen too many times before. A simple seat, a quiet moment, and then a test. Would he accept being pushed aside, or would he stand his ground? Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments. We love to hear from you. The airport was a symphony of movement, heels clicking against polished floors, voices blending into a hum of conversations, the occasional burst of laughter, and the heavy scent of coffee and jet fuel lingering in the air. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his posture relaxed but his eyes observant. A lifetime of experience had taught him to notice the small things: who watched, who ignored, who assumed. At the first-class gate, he handed over his ticket. The woman at the counter, dressed in the crisp navy blue of the airline's uniform, paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking from his ticket to his face. He recognized that pause. He had seen it before. But she plastered on a smile, scanned the ticket, and gestured him through. Inside the plane, the air was cooler, scented with the leather of plush seats and the sterile freshness of recirculated air. He found his row, settled into the wide seat, and exhaled. The weight of the world often pressed against his back, but here, at least for a few hours, he could let it go. Then a shadow fell over him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with silvering hair and an expensive watch, loomed beside him. The first-class privilege radiated off of him in the way he stood, entitled, assured, expectant. "You're in my seat," the man said, his voice edged with annoyance. He glanced at his ticket, then at the man. "No, I'm not." Before the other man could respond, a flight attendant appeared, a polite but firm smile on her lips. "Sir, would you mind switching seats? There was a mistake in the booking, and this gentleman has priority status." There it was again, that same assumption, that same invisible push, as if he had somehow wandered into a space that wasn't meant for him. He took a slow breath. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." The attendant's smile flickered, and something in her eyes shifted. The other passengers watched, some pretending not to. This was a moment, and he knew how moments like these played out. But this time, it would be different. The tension in the cabin thickened, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The flight attendant, still wearing that tight professional smile, signaled to another crew member. Within moments, a second attendant arrived, younger, with an eager energy that suggested he believed in his authority a little too much. "Sir, we really need you to move," the new attendant said, his tone carrying a forced patience. "We have a system for priority passengers, and unfortunately, this seat wasn't meant for you." He held their gaze, his face unreadable. He had been through this dance before, different settings, different players, same choreography. But there was something about today, about the way the man standing next to them smirked, arms folded as if he already knew how this would end. "I paid for this seat," he said again, calm, deliberate. "It's mine." The older man scoffed. "Come on, let's not make a big deal out of this." A few heads turned. Some passengers shifted in their seats, debating whether to intervene or pretend they weren't listening. "Sir," the first attendant said, her patience clearly running thin, "we can offer you a seat in business class. It's still a premium experience." He almost laughed. The language of power was always so polite when it was pushing you out. His fingers brushed against his phone, resting in his lap. One call. That's all it would take. He knew exactly who to dial, exactly which name would make them straighten their backs and regret every word that had left their mouths. But he waited. "Final chance," the younger attendant said. "If you don't move, we may have to escalate this." He smiled, slow and knowing, and lifted the phone to his ear. "Go ahead," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Let's escalate." The phone barely had time to ring once before a voice answered on the other end. Calm, measured, yet carrying the weight of someone who made decisions that mattered. He didn't need to explain much. Just a name, a flight number, and a quiet, "It's happening again." That was all. As he lowered the phone, the energy in the cabin shifted. The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence beginning to wane. They had expected compliance, perhaps irritation, but not this. This quiet assurance that he was not a man to be dismissed. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now openly watched. Some murmured to one another, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. The older white man beside them, the so-called priority passenger, was growing impatient. His foot tapped against the carpeted floor, his arms folded tighter across his chest. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "This is ridiculous." It didn't take long. The flight attendant's earpiece buzzed. She pressed a hand to it, her expression stiffening as she listened. Then, without another word, she pivoted and hurried toward the cockpit. The second attendant, the one who had spoken so smugly moments before, suddenly looked unsure. "Sir, if you could just—" A sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Everyone, please remain seated. We will be delaying takeoff briefly." Passengers exchanged glances. Delays were expected, but this felt different. There was an edge in the pilot's voice, an urgency. Then the real shift happened. A man in a navy suit strode down the aisle with quick, clipped steps. Not a flight attendant, not a regular airport worker. This was someone higher up. His name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, and his presence alone was enough to make the two attendants step back as if burned. The man's gaze locked onto him, sharp, assessing, but there was something else in his eyes, recognition. "Mr. Carter," the man said, voice tight, "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding." A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin. People glanced at one another, the name echoing in their minds, trying to place it. Carter only tilted his head slightly, watching the man with measured patience. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. The man in the suit, probably mid-level management, someone important enough to clean up messes but not powerful enough to prevent them, cleared his throat. "This is not how we treat our passengers, and I sincerely apologize. I can assure you the staff involved will be dealt with appropriately." The younger flight attendant paled. The woman beside him took a small step away, as if physically distancing herself from the consequences. Carter exhaled slowly, running a hand along the armrest of his seat. "Interesting," he mused, "because it seemed pretty intentional." The manager flinched. "Sir, I assure you." Carter held up a hand, silencing him. Now, the whispers were louder. Someone pulled out their phone. A camera flash flickered, someone recording. The weight of social media hung in the air like a waiting storm. The manager noticed too. He straightened, adjusting his tie, trying to salvage the moment before it spiraled further. "Please allow me to personally oversee this situation, Mr. Carter. We will ensure your flight experience remains—" Carter turned, finally looking at the man who had tried to take his seat. "Still think this is ridiculous?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't know who you were." Carter smiled. It was a small, sharp thing. "But that's the point, isn't it?" The man's mouth opened, then shut. His face flushed red. Another voice interrupted. The captain had emerged from the cockpit, his uniform pristine, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the manager, then at Carter, and nodded once. "This situation has been escalated," the captain announced, his voice carrying over the cabin. "Effective immediately, this flight crew is being relieved of their duties for this flight." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the passengers. The attendants stiffened. The manager nodded. "Your seats will remain as they are, Mr. Carter, and as for our staff—" His gaze swept over the two attendants, his disappointment sharp. "We'll be making changes." Carter could feel the energy shifting again. The whispers now carried something else. Approval. Vindication. He leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. He had seen injustices brushed aside too many times, seen moments like this end with nothing more than empty apologies. But this time the weight had fallen on the right shoulders. The attendants gathered their things in stunned silence. The man who had tried to take his seat now stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. Then, a voice from a few rows back, hesitant but strong. "Good for you, man." Another person nodded. Yeah, about time someone stood their ground. A woman in business attire lifted her phone, tapping at the screen. "This is already trending," she murmured. Carter didn't need to check. He knew how these stories spread. The world was watching. As the last of the disgraced staff exited the plane, the manager turned back to him one final time. Mr. Carter, if there's anything else we can do— Carter's gaze flicked to the man who had tried to take his seat. Maybe he'd like to volunteer for an economy seat instead. The man's face burned red. The manager hesitated for only a second before nodding to another attendant, the new one, replacing the others. "Find him another seat." The man sputtered, protesting, but no one was listening anymore. As Carter settled back into his seat, the announcement came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." The engines roared to life. The runway stretched out ahead, endless and open. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. This time things had gone differently. This time, justice had landed exactly where it belonged. The plane had taken off, but the storm wasn't over. Not yet. Carter kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was still turning, still processing. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, curious, approving, some even admiring. That wasn't why he had done it. He had learned a long time ago that standing up wasn't about recognition. It was about the ones who never got the chance to. The flight moved in quiet murmurs. Passengers typed on their phones, whispering to one another about what had just happened. The flight attendants, the new ones, moved through the aisles, their smiles measured, their movements careful. They knew. They had seen. Carter turned to the window, watching the clouds roll past. Then a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir." He turned, and there was the manager again, looking more composed now, but still carrying the weight of the moment. "I just wanted to apologize again. Personally," he said. "Situations like this, they shouldn't happen, and we take them seriously." Carter studied him for a moment. "Is that right?" The manager nodded. "There will be an internal review. The employees involved will no longer work for this airline, and moving forward, we will be making serious policy changes." Carter exhaled slowly. He had heard promises before. Words were easy. Change wasn't. But then, the manager lowered his voice. "I know this doesn't fix what happened, but because of this, things will be different." Carter held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. "See that they are." The manager hesitated, then offered his hand. Carter shook it, firm, steady. As the man walked away, Carter leaned back into his seat, glancing around the cabin. Somewhere, someone was watching. Somewhere, someone was thinking about their own battles, their own moments of injustice. And maybe, just maybe, the next time it happened to them, they'd know they weren't alone. The flight landed smoothly, but the ripple effects of what had happened mid-air were just beginning. Carter stood, stretching his legs, feeling the shift in energy around him. People weren't just passing by him anymore. They were acknowledging him. A nod from a businessman, a quiet thank you from a young woman near the exit. Even the pilot standing by the door gave him a knowing glance. As he stepped into the airport, his phone vibrated. He glanced down. 2 million views. The video had spread like wildfire. Headlines were already rolling in. First-class passenger denied seat until he made one call. Racial discrimination on flights, how one man exposed it in real time. Justice at 30,000 feet. Carter sighed, slipping the phone into his pocket. He hadn't asked for the attention, but maybe, just maybe, it would mean fewer stories like his. As he walked through the terminal, the world watching from their screens, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. This was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And today, at least for a moment, justice had found its seat. This story is just one example of what happens every day. People being judged, dismissed, and told they don't belong. But today, the ending was different. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Have you ever been treated unfairly just because of how you look or where you come from? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and together we can make sure no one has to face this alone. And if you want more powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's always more to tell, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.